Okay, good. Here we are. Good evening. It's Metta Spencer here in Toronto, and we have a very interesting conversation coming up. I want to introduce my guest for the evening, my panelist, my one-person panelist, Professor Harry Glasbeek, who is a retired professor emeritus of law from Osgood Law School at York University. He taught labor law there and corporate law, and then he created a course he called The Corporation as Criminal, which tips off his point of view, I think, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight, all of the ways in which corporations can misbehave and ways that the law allows them to get away with it. So I ran into Professor Glasbeek about 6 weeks or so ago at the faculty club at the University of Toronto, where he gave a talk. And then I was able to corner him during lunchtime and talk to him further because I thought his presentation was absolutely fascinating. So good evening, Harry. Would you say, Professor Glasbeek, would you say a word or two, because the camera will shift to you.
Thank you. I'll say a few words, and please call me Harry. I'm not used to Professor Glasbeek. I tried to get my daughters to call me Sir, and that never worked either. Yes, I remember our meeting, of course, at the faculty club at the University of Toronto. It was a very nice occasion when I got a chance to chat a bit about the kind of work I still do, retired as I am. And so I look forward to talking about it with you.
Good. All right. So let's plunge right into it, because you have a perspective on corporations that I've heard elements of this, of course, for many, many years. Anybody familiar at all with left-wing discourse will have heard complaints about the rights and privileges of corporations. But tell us about it. What's the problem?
Well, there is no one problem. My point of departure, of course, is as a lawyer. And the corporation is a legal tool. And as a legal tool, I assume that it is created to achieve legal purposes. And that's where I begin all my thinking. And the legal purposes that we aspire to, all of us, I think, we share in some way or another, are the values of our legal system. The values of our legal system in our political milieu are the values of liberalism and the values of the individual as a sovereign, autonomous person, entitled to think and act as he or she pleases, always subject to the framework of being within a society. Now, law, of course, is not dumb. It recognizes that people have different talents and resources, but it allows us to have those. And it's within that scheme of having our own talents and resources that we're all accorded equal respect. That's the starting point of all legal principles. And what you get there, as soon as you say that, you realize that the danger is that if we stop people from thinking and acting as we like, and I can't imagine any good society where we wouldn't favor the idea that individuals should be allowed to think and act as they would like to be able to do.
Sure.
So coercion is sort of the enemy of our legal system. And what we do is we ignore that when we get to the corporation. And there's a very elemental question for a lawyer then. If the corporation is a tool that the law creates for its purposes, but at the same time, it creates it in such a way that it defies those elemental legal values, something is terribly wrong. And that's where I begin with my thinking and my writing. Because corporations, as we all know, do some very, very antisocial things in our society. And we all know it and we get miserable about it. And what we do is, what a corporation basically is an avoider of risks for people who create risks. So that a person sets up an enterprise, or many people set up an enterprise, and they do it because they are trying to achieve their goals, which in our society these days are mainly to maximize profits. And as they do so, we should expect them to be responsible for the conduct of that enterprise. What the corporation enables them to do is to avoid responsibility. And that only encourages irresponsible acts. That's my main concern.
Mm-hmm. How does it do that? It certainly doesn't say you're now hereby permitted to do anything you please.
Well, it does in a way, strangely enough. It doesn't say that, of course, but strangely enough, it's so set up that it does that. We can give many examples. Perhaps it'd be easier to describe it. Law says you can form a corporation because it is an assemblage of capitals and people. So if people have spare capital that they want to invest in an enterprise, they're allowed to do so. They get it together with other people wishing to do the same thing. They have a common aim of a business that they want to pursue, and they can do so. And that bigger pool of capital that is now to be deployed, because it's an assembled set of capitals, could be deployed in principle more efficiently than all the other little separate ones by themselves. So the law encourages that because they're interested in economic efficiency, which will create more welfare, and more welfare could be distributed to all of us. All of these are good ideas on the face of it. And so the law encourages that. But the way it does it is by saying if you bring those capitals together, and those people bring their capitals together, they can register a corporation. And that's and we're so enamored of the idea that we give that to them as a matter of right. There's no discretion. We don't have to look at the character of the individuals coming together. Now, that's not so in most of our other circumstances. If you want to set up, a pub, before you get a license, there'll be a check. If you want to be a professional lawyer, there is a check on your character. You must not have committed a felony, and so on, so on. We know that. Nothing like that at all for a business person who sets up a corporation. There is no check into the person. So we're not interested in their character at all. So the corporation becomes the person that owns the property that's been invested. And therefore it's separate from all the investors in law. It's separate from the investors. And those investors, of course, use what they have, which is a voting power in that enterprise that's been set up. Those investors use it to appoint directors. Those directors appoint managers, who in turn hire workers, and then the enterprise goes its way. But the corporation is separate from the investors. It's separate from the creditors from whom they borrow money. It is separate from the directors. It is separate from the managers, and it's separate from the workers. It is a single person, all by itself. Now, because it's its property, remember, we're in a liberal milieu and in a capitalist liberal milieu, which means that property is considered an absolute right. It is the fundamental right for which we should start all thinking in our legal system. And so there, the corporation owns all that property. So as it is deployed by the directors, the managers, the workers, and so on, as that property is deployed, it is the corporation which is conducting the business, not the investors, not the directors, not the executives, not the managers, not the workers, the corporation. So the corporation is responsible, not the others. And now you can see the gap. All of a sudden, there is a gap.
In a way, it makes me curious. When did this begin? I mean, there were not, the Greeks didn't have corporations. When it was this?
The Romans did. The Romans did, actually. The Romans did, and they formed corporations but for completely different purposes. They created corporations when they needed a communal thing to be done. Like, for instance, they had a lot of problem with fires, of course, because everything was made of wood and there were no safeguards. And so they would set up municipal fire associations, which they created as a corporation so that they could act together, so that you have a body which could conduct the business of firefighting. And then later on, it became churches in our parts of the world, in the European parts of the world, it became churches. Churches had a problem because they would appoint clergymen to administer their religious services in particular areas, in particular parishes, but the church property was invested in the clergyman's name because somebody had to own it, right? But that always ran a danger. The clergyman might run off with the property. So they created a corporation sole. And so that the property now belonged to the church. Through the corporation sole, the clergyman had none. So we started off with quite different intentions for creating corporations. It was just a way, it was a convenience of a different sort. The modern corporation in Anglo-American law, it's a little different in other European situations, but it began roughly, it came out of the adventurers of the colonial times. People would go out and colonize the United States or Canada or Australia or India. And what happened was that rich people would bottom a boat. They would invest in a boat, and the English or the Spanish or the Portuguese or the Dutch government would send, along with the boat, would send some military with them to help them go and get the resources from other places. And then those corporations went there, and if they were successful, the people would come back and they would get the profits from the voyage. Of course, they ran a real risk of losing it. So very quickly, they started setting up legal mechanisms so that they could get rid of their obligations if it took too long for the boats to get back and so on. And we gradually developed the modern corporation as an entity for that.
This when we hear about the East India Corporation.
Yeah, that's it. The East India Company was called
Hudson's Bay Company. Oh,
exactly.
Those were corporations.
Those were the original corporations, and they were the East India Corporation was probably the first large multinational the world's ever known. And the Hudson Bay Company is still to this day called the Gentlemen of the Hudson Bay Adventure, the Gentlemen Adventures of the Hudson Bay Company, and because they were adventurers. And they bottomed the boat. They could lose the boat, right? There was quite a risk. The boat would founder and so on. So it was formed around these ideas. And of course, they became colonizers on behalf of various governments. And so when we call the Spanish pirates, of course, that was really their boats going to try and take the resources that the English wanted. So the English called them pirates, the Spanish called the English pirates. And they had these wars, but they were really colonial wars between companies. And then very often when they settled in places like the United States, you had the Baltimore Company for it, the Maryland Corporation, the Pennsylvania Corporation, the Virginia Corporation. They were all corporations. They set up, and they went to, and the Hudson Bay Company. And so they went to these regions, which were not countries, with their military force. Their bylaws of the corporation, the articles under which they worked to do their thing, maximize their profits, search out resources, which often included killing people, of course. As they did those things, as they were now doing their thing, those bylaws became the dominant force in those areas, and so they became the government. They became so the East India Company was a colonizing colony of India, and the
Raj.
The Raj, yes, and they employed local cadres to help them along, and so it's a very interesting history. If your watchers are interested, I think a good book to read about that is a book by David Korten, Korten, who is an American writer, and it'd be worth reading. I
know his name now. Yeah.
Anyhow, but for us in England, the modern corporation began around 1844 when we passed a statute. They failed. Some of these corporations failed. One of the difficulties was if they owed obligations, there was nobody to sue because the people disappeared. The people were many who were members, and you couldn't find them. And so they failed, and there were huge deficits and losses being resulting. So after the famous South Sea bubble in England, where the company went under, and many other companies went under, and the country was in dire straits, they banned the granting of charters for nearly 100 years in England. So that you couldn't form corporation unless the government specifically permitted it. In 1844, all that changed. And from 1844 on, we've had what the kind of corporation that I described a few minutes ago. And so it's from that period onwards that we get the modern corporation for profit.
Now, one of the things that I've heard people say is that the really pernicious legal invention is the notion that a corporation is a person.
Yes.
It is. I think you made that point, but I've heard other people.
Oh yes, no, because what we need, and you've got to think now. If I can ask people to think a bit as a lawyer, well, the property that all that contributed property from all these various investors who've invested in this one business enterprise, which is to be run by a corporation, all that property is now owned by to be able to own it and to deploy it and to enter into transactions with it. You've got to have somebody who owns it. And so they decide that the corporation owns it. But in order for it to participate in what we love to believe is a liberal market economy, it has to be an individual. We don't like collectives, right? As a matter of a given. And we don't want collectives because they exercise too much power, collectives against other individuals. So we call the corporation an individual. And in order to be able to do that, we say it's a person with, and the statutes actually say that quite specifically, it's a person with all the capacities of any normal adult person. So it can enter in own property, it can contract, it can order things, but of course, it can't feel anything. It can't think.
It can live forever, isn't it?
It can live forever because there is nothing, it is just an illusion, right? We've created that out of thin air. And so it's a marvelous idea, really. It's the most imaginative idea. And so that and I think I told two stories at that meeting, which I really like. People who are anti-corporate activists, and there are many of them, try to show it's not a person at all. And so a man drove down a carpool lane and hoping that he would be stopped, and he was. And he was by his car, apparently by himself. So an arresting officer said to him, "Oh, no, sir, you're going to be booked because you shouldn't be in this lane by yourself." And he said, "I'm not by myself. Look, I've got my articles of incorporation of my company right next to me. Right? It's the person." And of course, it's not accepted. And my other favorite story is about a woman who got a marriage permit and went to a park and had everybody dress up in all the clothes that people do to have a wedding, and went through a ceremony with a marriage celebrant, and she was marrying a corporate person. She wasn't born, because they'd only been born like 10 minutes ago, so it might be a bit young, she said. And then she went to register the marriage, and of course the registration was refused, and she got her permit application money back, because we know it's not a person. But by pretending it's a person, all sorts of amazing things now happen. As soon as it's a person, it can act as if it's an individual. So therefore, in the United States, we see this plainly. It is allowed to participate in politics as an individual.
Yeah. This whole thing about the Citizens United,
yes, that's it.
Is an effort to what would it be legally? What was the basis for the Supreme Court saying that a corporation can spend as much money as it wants on trying to get people elected? And what would happen if they overthrew that?
Well, it was never the case, so they can always overthrow it. I mean, law is wonderfully manipulable. But the reasoning goes as follows: that because it is a person, it has freedom of speech. And because it can't speak, because it's just a blob after all that we imagine, it speaks through money. And so it's allowed to spend money unless there is something contrary. And so that is what they've done. In various states in Australia, where I spent part of my time,
where?
In Australia, some cities have actually accorded corporations in the city voting rights. which are greater than individual persons' voting rights for municipal elections, because they're more important to the city than other ratepayers, therefore they should have a say. So, you see the logic of that personhood is very important. And
that is the worst thing I've ever heard.
Well, it is not a good thing, but it makes sense, of course. And
if one thing makes sense, I guess makes about as much sense as marrying a corporation.
Well, yes, and so that we. But that one person, by also calling it one person, you get many other advantages. For instance, one of the things we hate, as I mentioned a few minutes ago in our society, because we're a liberal polity, we have a liberal philosophy, we believe in individual responsibility and autonomy. Because of all that, we do not like collective actions. And we don't like collective actions because potentially a collective can exert more power than individuals by themselves. And therefore, they might be coercive. So we don't like collectives. And that's the great problem at the bottom of it all, apart from all politics and calls about socialism and capitalism. Apart from all that, that's a great problem trade unions always have. Because by force, they form a collective, because they try to reduce competition amongst themselves in order to get better terms and conditions at work. And by calling various capitals one rather than a collective, because remember, the corporation is formed because it's good as a collective. We can collectivize capitals, collectivize people. It'll be more efficient. That's what the law believes in. But then calls it one person. And by calling it one person, it can now no longer has to justify its conduct in any way. It is, even though it obviously has more coercive power than all these individuals with their own little capitals could have by themselves. And so that we overcome one of the difficulties that unions and workers and ordinary people have to overcome by the simple appellation of the corporation as an individual, ignoring that it's in fact a collective.
Okay, I'm a little confused because we do have this. It certainly isn't just you can do everything. For example, take the Enron case. Now they did hold some particular individual officers accountable, right?
Yes.
And indeed, I think according to the law, if you're on the board of directors of a corporation, you have certain legal responsibilities and can be sued and held responsible for the misdeeds of the corporation.
No, that's not quite right. They may be, but that's unlikely. Let me step one back. The directors are, the responsibility of a director is quite simply to act in the best interest of the corporation. That's what our statutes say. Now, remember, the corporation as a entity which is inanimate by itself, by definition, has no interests. So where do they understand the best interest to come from? And over time, especially in the last 4 or 5 decades, in our parts of the world, Anglo-American jurisdictions, everybody accepts that the best interest of the corporation are to maximize the profits of that corporation. That's the best interest, we say. Directors.
But there have to be laws. Surely you can't.
No, there are laws. They have to abide by all the laws that we abide by. So a corporation could be guilty of lying, cheating, stealing, murder, potentially all of these things, because it's a person. It can be. But of course, it doesn't make much sense. It doesn't care, to be honest, because it's inanimate. So we can only, what we hope is that if we hold the corporation responsible, that indirectly directors, investors, workers, managers will be deterred from such behavior in the future. And that may or may not happen. And so it's an indirect punishment. And that, again, notice, this is not how the law is meant to work. If you've committed a wrong, it punishes you to deter you and me. But it's you that is a responsible person. With a corporation, we punish the corporation, and we can't, and that doesn't work. So we punish a director, or perhaps a worker, And we hope that that will, in the future, make other directors and workers behave better in the corporation. And that's sort of an indirect thing. And that, so that, again, we distort the legal framework that we use for all our other purposes. But more importantly, to get more detailed about the way it works, the corporation can be personally responsible. Directors can be made responsible for what was done by the corporation because they set the policy and they executed it in some way or another with their management team. So directors can be held responsible for specific misconduct or even for duties that the law specifically imposes on them. For instance, we might have an environmental statute which says that the director is responsible for maintaining a certain, maintain particles in the air below a certain level or something like that. And the director can be held responsible for that, of course, as an individual, because he or she has not done that job properly. And so can executives and workers. So they can all be held responsible, but in their own right, more than. Sometimes they can be held responsible for what the corporation has done wrong, because they are the acting, guiding mind and will of the corporation. But again, they're responsible. So what happened, that's what really happened in the Enron case. These people were held responsible for their conduct. Mostly they defrauded the corporation as well as other people. You know? so you get a multipolar.
Right. Now, if they're all together and if they're all on the same page and they're really trying to advance the interests of the corporation, then they're liable to not be prosecuted individually for any particular infraction. Is that it?
Pretty well. That is one of the excuses here. But most importantly, I think more important than that is the actual way it works. When we go after a director or so on, three things kick in for the people who enforce the law. One, they think of directors as belonging to the elites of our society. So they don't like to think of them as real wrongdoers. They like to think of them as sort of captives of their circumstance as they're chasing profits. So they don't like doing it, but they will do it. They will do it from time to time. But even when they do it, sometimes it's very difficult. Unless it's a specific duty that the director has breached, and we talk, and then it's very hard to know whether this particular director was actually the cause of the problem that we're looking at in the enforcement process. It's in what we call an endocratic corporation. For instance, I did a piece on Chevron the other day. Chevron has something like 2,000 subsidiaries. Mm-hmm. And thousands and thousands of workers and directors. So it's hard to find who made the decision about which we're complaining. So it's very.
What would have been the complaint, for example? What was the allegation that Chevron had done wrong?
In this case, it was. We want to hear the story? It's a terrible story. It happened in 1964. Texaco, which was then taken over by Chevron in due course, started oil explorations in Ecuador, and they ruined the whole area of Ecuador, left huge pits of oil, and water was polluted. 30,000 people have come forward saying they lost their tribal lives and their cultures. I mean, and the case is still ongoing. And the Chevron took it over. Chevron then took the argument that it went from jurisdiction. It's too long a story to tell properly, but they went from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but they never admit that anybody was liable for anything. But finally, an Ecuadorian government found they were. So they then went, a court found they were. So then they went to the United States court, who said that the judgment there was obtained by fraud, and may well have been. I've got no way of knowing. So they wouldn't be recognized in the United States. So they've come to Canada to sue in Canada because Chevron has subsidiaries here. And they say we can sue scanners. The Supreme Court of Canada says, yes, you can do that. But since then, an Ontario Court of Appeal has said, yes, but not in this case. Because we think that Chevron, the subsidiary, Chevron Canada, is not to be held responsible for what Chevron did, which is the US parent. So that's what I mean by the difficulty of finding out who did what, and the difficulty of pretending that Chevron, the United States parent, is a person, and Chevron Canada is a completely different person, even though Chevron thinks and admits that they're all interlocked. And so it becomes very complex for us to deal with these situations. And worst of all, and that's the Enron case you're talking about, and you saw that in all the subprime mortgage cases, in the United States, we've now got this expression, right? Too big to fail, too big to jail. What did they actually mean? Well, they didn't want to prosecute the corporations and put them out of existence because they were worried about what that would do to the banking system. So here you have a situation where the law is saying, we think you're guilty of terrible things, but we're not going to force the law against you because so that then people said, well, why don't you go after the directors who are and executives who've done all this? And they said, we really don't want to jail anybody. And the reason they don't is because the executives come to the enforcement people and say, look, it's going to be very hard to prove that we did anything wrong in the way that I've just described. But even if so it's going to cost you a lot of time and effort. But I'll tell you what we can do for you. Because we actually can make our company do anything we like. I mean, that's the key. We're not supposed to be able to say it, but they do. And they say, well, then in that case, I'll do a bargain with you. You get some money from the corporation. We'll make sure it pays you.
This is just an out bribe then.
And a bargain, a deal, is sort of plea bargaining. And you let us off the hook. And we'll get money. And of course, in that case, in the American subprime mortgage cases, not only did the banks paid huge amounts of money, by the way, they were very large amounts, paid large amounts, but they were mostly monies that the banks got from the bailouts. So we are very ineffective. We're sort of rendered ineffective by our own creature, and that, of course, only, as they would say in voting, that only encourages the bastards. Right? I mean, they're not on the hook.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now if you believe in democracy,
I try to
find a solution.
A solution.
I think democracy has problems, all kinds of other problems, but certainly it sounds to me as if this is allowing room for all kinds of misdeeds without accountability.
Yes.
And with difficulty in holding anybody to the law and punishing anybody who violates it.
Yes, I think you've hit the nail on the head. Perhaps I could answer the question by giving you a couple of examples to show how that actually might work, and then try a solution for you. And it's my favorite way of illustrating it is by talking about the asbestos cases. Everybody knows about asbestos and asbestos poisoning. For decades, literally decades, the people who were responsible for processing and mining asbestos knew that asbestos was directly related to terrible diseases and premature deaths. And in 1931 was the first accepted medical paper showing the connections. And they kept on producing and mining and mining and mining, poisoning people all over the world. The number that the ILO has at the moment is that from now on, starting from now, for the next 50 years, every year, 107,000 people will die prematurely because of the connection to asbestos. 5 million plus people will die in the next 50 years. In all that time, there's only been one successful prosecution against against individuals at a corporation. It was an Italian corporation, and it was a company called Eternit. And finally, a major shareholder and the CEO of the company was prosecuted. And after 16 years of trials, he was convicted. He has now appealed, and he's 87. And he has now appealed, and the trials and have gone back to trial. He'll be dead long before it's over, I think. And that's an amazing result. Because imagine if you don't say asbestos, but you say arsenic. And you think of a serial killer who just puts arsenic hither, thither, and everywhere, hoping that people will have it, and they die. You know, I think we would think that the most heinous of offenses, that's what they did. In 1919, for instance, life insurance companies in the United States and Canada would not insure anyone who had anything to do with asbestos, because although they didn't have the full medical evidence, they knew that those people died earlier than other people. So we've known for a long time, and they kept using it. They kept using it. They kept using it. And so same with tobacco and anything else you can't name like that. And we don't hold people responsible. So my response to that is, why don't we just simply say, corporations are just things we create. They're artifices, and they're very useful because they create all that wealth in terms of money. Right? They combine capitals, they combine people, they work together, and they produce monetary wealth, good services which yield wealth. And we think that's a good thing because we believe in that kind of economy. We believe in a private ordering for profit economy. So we think that's a good thing. But in doing so, we've sacrificed a basic principle of our legal and justice system, namely that individuals should take responsibility for their own acts. I think that's just wrong. So I think what we should say is to make those individuals who control and benefit from corporate activities personally responsible, and just directly personally responsible. And then it would be just as if you took up a business, you did something wrong, you would be held responsible. It would be no different. The corporation would be ignored. Now, people will automatically say, but then you would ruin the corporation and we like it so much, right? It brings us so much good. So that's a debate that has to be undertaken. There are legal difficulties for what I'm saying, but they're not insuperable. One of the things we haven't talked about is that one of the great benefits to inveigle people into forming a corporation is to give them what we call limited liability. That is, they do not lose anything more than their investment if the corporation has obligations which it cannot pay. So the corporation which has acted on their behalf leaves debts and obligations around. The investors, that is the shareholders, are not responsible for them. They may lose their money because the shares are not worth much anymore, but they will not be held personally responsible. And because they're separate persons from the corporation, remember that's the most important point, they're also immune from prosecution for what the corporation has done. So that fiscally they're given protection, and legally and criminally they're given protection. I think that is wrong. And so we should get rid of that. Now, if to get rid of that, of course, will raise howls of agony by people who believe in our economic system and that our economic system benefits from the corporate structure. That's where the debate has to go, I believe.
Okay, I'm a little confused about two things. One is the crime of making an antisocial act, poisoning people or destroying their land or whatever, and holding somebody accountable for a crime that harms other people is one thing. The other is financial responsibility, because I think if you get, what is it, mesothelioma from asbestos, isn't there, I hear on TV all the time, there's going to be a big settlement. If you think you have this disease, let us know because you may be in for a windfall from this settlement. So presumably some court has said that some corporation has to pay people money to compensate them for the illnesses that they have caused.
These are two very different things. You're right. By the way, that's an American phenomenon, not a Canadian one.
Why?
Because we get workers' compensation here, and the Americans sue for product liability. So that in our case, our people would get income replacement for the loss through our workers' compensation system. In the United States, what people do is these lawyers who advertise on TV and say there will be a settlement and so on, what they're doing is they're suing for having put out a defective product, namely asbestos. And so that's why they're very litigious, and that's another debate entirely. Americans are so litigious, not because they're innately different, it's because they've got a very poor welfare system, and that's the only way they can get compensation. And and of course they're encouraged by law to do that, by lawyers in particular. But yes, you're right. that is a different issue. But you can get settlements and but those are compensatory monies which come out of the corporate coffers. They don't come out of an individual's hands. None of the actors themselves, the person who made the decisions about asbestos, are being held responsible, except indirectly. Some may lose their jobs, their share values may go down, right? Things of that nature. But that's indirect, and they're not the same people, because the direct, for instance, the asbestos is a good example. The latency period is somewhere between 25 and 40 years. And the people who are currently directors and shareholders are quite different from the people who were directors and shareholders at the time of the poisoning, right? So that so it's again a distortion of the legal system if they're the ones who have to pay for the wrong. But
anybody who is actually responsible for having fraudulently kept the public from knowing that they're being poisoned by or endangered by something,
seem to be protected.
People should be held.
That's what I believe. And we rarely do that. As I said, we rarely do that. It happens sometimes, as in the Italian case and some other cases. But we really, the other story I like to tell, you may remember, I think I told you at the University of Toronto, a very famous Canadian case is the West Ray explosion in Nova Scotia in 1992. It was a terrible explosion. 26 miners died in the explosion. The mine was set up in a very, very dangerous site. And that's why it hadn't been mined for years. But the local government thought it would create job and welfare by opening the mine again. It couldn't find any senior mining company to want to do it because it seemed impossible to do and make it safe and make a profit. And if it's not profitable, they don't do it. They finally found a man called Frame, who ran a company called Curra Resources, who did do it. He got himself lots of subsidies from the government to do it. And he was very celebrated for his enterprise of setting up this. And everybody rejoiced. The workers rejoiced because they wanted the jobs. The shareholders rejoiced because they got an investment to make. Everybody was happy. But the mine was very poorly operated. There were 52 violations that the inspector had found before it blew up. None of them was remedied. No penalties were enforced for the 52 orders. And when it blew up, charges were laid. And again, this is the point we were making to each other a minute ago. Charges were laid against the corporation, but the corporation went bankrupt, so that was useless. Charges were laid against two of the local managers, but they were procedurally badly done, so they failed. Some Nova Scotia inspectorate people lost their jobs because they hadn't done their job properly. Other than that, nothing happened. The man who set it up, Frame, through that Curra Resources, just disappeared from view. Mm-hmm. And he didn't even give evidence before the Commission of Inquiry, which was set up. And so that's what I mean by it's possible that he could have been charged. It's possible they could have done it, but it hardly ever happens. And he should be been held responsible, and he wasn't.
Okay, now I'm thinking, as you're talking, I'm thinking, what's the difference between a corporation doing criminal things that harm people that they should be held accountable for and punished for doing, and a government doing the same thing? And I'm thinking, right now we have this thing going on about the journalist Khashoggi, who was murdered, and Donald Trump says, well, we're not going to cut off our sale of weapons to Saudi Arabia because we are making a lot of money from it and there are jobs involved and we can't afford to do that. And it's not just Donald Trump, because our own Canadian government has the same issue because they were selling something like armored personnel carriers to Saudi Arabia, and they're not going to cut off that sale. They're not going to stop doing it. Never mind the fact that these are weapons that are going to be used against the people in Yemen, and not just one journalist, but thousands and maybe millions of people will be killed and injured and their lives ruined because of selling these weapons. And the justification is, well, we make a lot of money from it. What's the difference, Harry? Tell me the difference between I think that's criminal.
It is criminal. And I agree with you. And it's a very nice juxtaposition. The difference is non-existent for me in this particular case. If the Saudi government indeed did kill this man, intentionally, and for whatever reason they thought was justifiable, they behaved criminally, and people should be held responsible for that. We have no way of doing it. That's very much like a corporation, by the way. And the argument of defense is the justification for behaving badly is exactly the same by us. As you say, both our government, which I think one of the first acts Mr. Trudeau conducted when he entered into office was to say he's going to approve Mr. Harper's contract with Saudi Arabia, because, right? And so the and of course the Trump regime has very openly said we got $450 billion on the line. I'm not going to sacrifice that just to be just and righteous. So now that troubles me a lot. The difference, I guess, between corporations and governments is that governments can be notionally in democratic countries can be held accountable by the people and can be prosecuted by the people, and sometimes are, very rarely again, but they're often punished politically if in no other way. That may not be true in Saudi Arabia. I have maybe a different kind of situation. But so there is a difference in accounts. But you're right that the impulse is the same in both situations. That is, we have an empirical argument to justify unprincipled behavior. And that's what's unacceptable to me, and I don't want to accept that under any circumstance, no matter how it arises. I know much more about corporations than I do about Saudi Arabia, so I ought to be a little careful. But in corporations, we notionally could hold them responsible. We notionally could hold everybody responsible, and we don't, or we rarely do. Where we do occasionally, it's not true that we never do, but hardly ever. It's hard to sort of pinpoint what I really worry about. It's the fact we make no dent on the problem. We know that tobacco is bad. We haven't forbidden it. You see, we had a choice. That's another governmental choice. Government allows tobacco to be sold because they get revenue from it. So as they're allowed to sell it, they say, don't smoke. It's bad for your health. Put ads on, but please, if you do smoke, pay us taxes. And alcohol, and so on and so forth. Sugar drinks. And here's another example. And we're so interested in money as a way of measuring our welfare that we lose sight of what we want to do. My favorite example at the moment is we grow the GDP, and then we say it's good. That's what corporations do. They produce goods, services, and the gross domestic product goes up. Every time you make a good or you sell it, if there is a disaster, it's good for you, because you have to rebuild the houses, and you have to have lawyers and insurance companies. And if you have more highway traffic, that's a good thing, because you build more cars, more roads, use more oil. But of course, it's also disasters. We don't make a calculation that it's all sensible. So when we say that there is a quantitative leap in money, and that corporations really help us get there, we forget the harms they do, even when they behave respectably, or reasonably respectably. So, for instance, my favorite example, as I said, at the moment is plastic bottles, which are much in the news these days. There are 500 billion plastic bottles produced every year for drinking vessels, soft drinks of one kind or another. Coca-Cola alone makes 110 billion a year, which is 3,400 every second. Right? And they take 450 years to degrade. So what you have, so they make a lot of money. They're producing huge amounts of GDP, but they're also causing a fantastic amount of harm. So I think the empirical argument that they make to justify the breaching of principles is not a satisfactory one. And
I 100% agree with you. The question is, how do we get from here to there? more responsible kind of economy. And let me mention something that I just happened to be reading today, an article by a man named Jeremy Lent. And what he has to say is that he proposes 5 different ways of changing the corporate law so as to reduce the opportunity for them to do these criminal activities. And if I can just tell you, I'll list them, and then in the time left, let's see what you think about them. He says that every corporate charter should be required to have a triple bottom line, PPP, people, profit, and planet. Right now, of course, profit is the guiding objective for the corporation, and that's the top priority for them to try to maximize. But there should be equal responsibility to look after the well-being of people everywhere, and planet, the environment. So that would change the obligations of the directors and of the executives. Number 2, he would have the charters for big corporations be renewable, and every 5 years they would have to come up for renewal again. Now, I think he does not do a very clear job of explaining the grounds on which a corporation would be able to get its charter renewed. I'd love to explore that. He says, for example, there should be some sort of a process of sortition where you get a body of people, sort of like you select a jury by random chance from the population, people who are able to examine whether the corporation has in fact looked after people, profit, and planet, and therefore whether they should have their corporate charter renewed or not. I think we could maybe improve on that system of judging the merits of the corporation, but let's let that pass for the moment. This third suggestion he has to do with the notion of financial transaction taxes, that every time a stock is sold, that a tiny tax be placed on it to be used for other important things that society needs to have handled. And his point on this is not an unusual idea. I think the Tobin tax is sort of related to that, and you see other versions of it. But he would have the amount of the financial transaction tax vary according to how long the stock has been held, because much of the trouble that goes on now has to do with the fact that the trading is very, very, very fast, microseconds. These sales take place, and if a stock is held for a length of time, then you can begin to say who's responsible for decisions that have been made and hold people accountable. But if you don't, if split second kind of sales, it's just nonsense. So he even would say, well, if they sell it in less than 1 day, the transaction tax maybe should be 10%. And if you hold it 20 or 30 years, it goes down to tiny percentage, a fraction of 1%. And that's another point. Then he has 2 others that are not as, I think, directly, clearly related to corporations. And that is he would cap billionaires at $5 billion apiece. Nobody should be allowed to possess more than $5 billion. Okay, I'll settle for my $5 billion. But I don't know what he's going to do with the rest, or exactly how he would, what he's going to do, take their stock away from them, or take Facebook away from Mark Zuckerberg. I don't know that. Then the number 5 is that there should be a crime called ecocide, and it should be punishable through the International Criminal Court. Well, I don't know how you would impose legislate crime, and I don't think the International Criminal Court is the place where they could administer it or adjudicate it. But at any rate, those are the 5 suggestions that he has. Do you think that any of those would be helpful? And if so, which ones?
I think it's a very sophisticated set of ideas. I have to think about. I think I start with the last one as being the most useful, and I'll tell you why. The idea of having ecocide as a crime, if we could somehow or other implement that, and obviously the political difficulties are enormous because you have to get everybody to agree, and
mm-hmm. I agree.
And that would be extraordinarily difficult. And it's already been done in part, right? Countries like Bolivia, and I think there's one other, as I remember, have declared nature a person, as we could declare a corporation a person. So that any harm to that person is the same kind of harm that you would cause a person. So there is that kind of thinking is about, and makes sense to a number of people. What I like about that idea is that it says that profit is not the essential purpose of having cooperation. All these other ideas, by the way, are about continuing creating wealth by allowing people to pursue profits. And profits, and then he wants to somehow or another, it seems to me, from the way you've described it, tailor the market, saying the markets in which you can operate. The idea of profits is still maximum. Now, people make profits, and you can see this everywhere now. They make profits out of things which are completely valueless. For instance, I saw a machine the other day where you can have an app and you can make your cappuccino after you take a photo of yourself with your mobile. You put it into the app, it will print it through the espresso machine, and your face will be on top of the cream. Now, they can make profit out of that, but I can't think of many more things which are as useless as that. A similar thing you can do with toast. You can burn your face into your toast if you wish to do so, right? And so we can make profits out of lots of things which are terribly, terribly wasteful and harmful, because these are just funny, but they're harmful things as well, which we do all the time. So I think the first step is for us to start thinking about what kind of a qualitative world we want to live in. Ecocide therefore appeals to me because it tells you about what kind of love we should have for the planet, and therefore for each other, I hope, and and compassion, and that the calculation should always be that risks should not be undertaken if they undermine the essence of human life and natural life. Now going back to it, and I try to remember them, as you mentioned them, the triple bottom line, which I've heard before, that is again a good idea, because you're protecting people and the planet, but also profit, and that will be intention. That will be that's going to be very difficult. So you're going to have a argy-bargy about how much profit, how much planet, what's going. Right, and the same thing is going to take. Now, the removal of the registration after every 5 years as a possibility is an old American idea. They've always believed that that the grant of personhood to a corporation is a subsidy to business, and therefore they should lose it if you're not doing your job. And if you're doing more harm than good, you should remove it. You're quite right. The question is, how would you implement that? But again, that's a good idea. That's a good idea. I'd say the billionaire thing, I think, is something that's quite a different issue. That's about inequality of wealth in our society, and that you might have whether or not you have a corporate world or a capitalist world. Indeed, we had it under feudalism as well, and so that belongs analytically to a different set of ideas, I think. And so and the Tobin tax, as you say, or the tax on the transactions, again, it retains the essence of profit maximization at any cost, subject to a tax. So you make less. So remember, it's not so long ago that 90% tax on your income was the norm. Now we're down to about 30%. So the idea that you would introduce a tax but maintain the same world is really not groundbreaking. I think that just faces a current problem that Mr. Len sees, but it doesn't go to the deep problems that we have. So I think these are sort of sophisticated ideas and well worth. I mean, I'm just responding on the spot, but they're thoughtful ideas, I should think. But I think they invite debate.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. So we have a way to go before we're.
Oh yes. Oh yes.
I think those are good things to be thinking about. And I have several others I'd like to add to it. But at any rate, in fact, we will be having other conversations like this in the future. Our time is up, Harry, but I want to tell our viewers that we do this every week, that every Monday night from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Time, I invite somebody in to his own webcam, to his own computer, so that we can have a good conversation about some serious global issue. And this is part of a whole larger project called Project Save the World, where we are trying to reduce the risk of 6 global threats to human survival, threats that could, in a very short interval, wipe out 1 billion people or so. And I'm thinking of war and weapons, especially nuclear, global warming, famine, pandemics, major radiation exposure from something like a reactor explosion, and cyber attacks. But none of the proposals that we're promoting for resolving these or reducing the risk of these threats are likely to be able to be enacted unless we make a few other major adjustments in our society, such as where you get the money and how are you going to curb the power of various groups to prevent you from doing some of these things, these innovations. So we have a list of enabling measures that we need to put in place. And I consider that we've been talking about one of those enabling measures tonight. That is that unless we do something about the power of corporations over our lives, then some of the other measures that we need to take to resolve some of the problems about the 6 global threats, we won't be able to do. So that's why we keep talking about these issues. I don't know what next week will be. Every week I line up a different one. But it's been fun, Harry. I enjoyed this very much. If you know, talking about such a terrible problem can be enjoyable, this has been as much fun as we could have. So thank you. And I hope to see everybody next week at this same place. Peace Magazine's Facebook page between 8 and 9 p.m. Eastern Time. And you can see our videos there and elsewhere at other times. Thank you. Good night.
Good night.